We are in the most lawless era we've ever had with the left. They have no regard for locking up former officials, going after people, destroying the border.
Hello and welcome to GBN America. My name is Stephen Edgington. Does Trump's conviction mean the end of American democracy? To discuss, I'm joined by Victor Davis Hanson. What does Trump's conviction mean for American democracy?
Well, for American democracy, that is the collective self-interest of the country. It never happened before. We've never, ever indicted a former president nor the leading presidential candidate. And we've never done it on so many numerous occasions. If you count the E. Jean Carroll case, it's the civil case, that's 5. But most importantly, we've never had an administration actively engaged in trying to destroy its political candidate. When I say actively, Jack Smith had no record of success as a special counsel. The Bob McConnell case in Virginia, it was a complete disaster, and his wife has made a very favorable documentary of Michelle Obama. He's a partisan. And he is charging Trump with essentially the same crimes that Robert Hur said that the president was guilty of Joe Biden, but he could not be prosecuted because of his, I guess you'd call it cognitive decline. Then we had Fannie Willis, the Georgia prosecutor, whose paramour and chief investigator, Nathan Wade, and they were under a cloud of suspicion. Why would he go to the White House counsel's office and consult with them? It's just, I mean, how many local, of the thousands of local DAs, none of them are ever invited to the White House to talk to the counsel. And then finally, why would the third highest person in the DOJ of hundreds of prosecutors take a cut or resign to go work in the Manhattan plague scandal Alvin Bragg office? And yet that all happened. So I think people realize that the left felt that it could break constitutional norms through lawfare or trying to remove Trump from the ballot or impeaching him twice as soon as they won the majority in the House, or trying him as a private citizen. And I think that's one reason why this morning in the Quinnipiac poll, he's 4 to 5 points ahead nationally, and he's ahead in all the swing states.
What could be the political consequences of putting Trump in prison?
That's a good question, because each time we have been told that should Donald Trump actually be convicted of a crime, or first it said if he's actually indicted of a crime, it's going to hurt him. And we found out in the primary, Ron DeSantis was 4 or 5 points ahead when Trump was indicted. And then that reversed almost automatic. Then we were told if he were to be convicted and the rubric convicted felon would be used, that would be detrimental. So in the Bragg case, he was kept off the campaign trail for most of 5 weeks. And he used the New York environment to appeal to non-traditional constituencies, Latinos, blacks, poor people in the outer boroughs. And he actually went up, and he was running almost dead even, and now he's ahead. So we don't know. They believe that if he's actually in jail, and I do believe Alvin Bragg will try to put him in jail, then that will be a stigmata that he can't get overcome. I don't think that's true. I think the people feel that this revolutionary Jacobin party hijacked the government for 3.5 years. They destroyed the border. They gave us hyperinflation. They humiliated us in Afghanistan. They don't know what they're doing with Ukraine or Israel. Crime is out of control. And we're draining the strategic petroleum reserve again before the election, but we have plenty of oil in the ground that they won't pump. So I think those are going to be the issues, and as well as his cognitive decline. I hope Trump is a little calm tonight, because if history is any guide, during one of the 2 debates, the State of the Union, that abhorrent Phantom of the Opera, semi-fascist hyper-MAGA speech, in each of those cases, he abdicated his role as president for 4 or 5 days, slept, and then there was all these rumors swirling around of the cognitive stimulants that he had taken to animate him. And I suppose that will happen again this time tonight.
We're recording this interview just before the debates happen. How important do you think the debates are in this election cycle?
If he were to come out, as he did in the second debate, and Trump was to come out as he did in the second debate, it will have then, because I think Trump won the second debate, although 60 million people had already voted. I think that he will continue to be the nominee and it will have no effect whatever. If he comes out in the first debate and Trump tries to disrupt him and yell at him and scream at him, it'll give him an advantage. That's choice number two. If he comes out and he displays after an hour any of the cognitive decline that has been very serious the last 2 months, then I think he didn't pass the Democratic stress test, which accounts for this historic gambit of actually having a debate. It was prompted, remember, by the Democrats, but a debate before either candidate had even been nominated. We've never been, so we're in uncharted territory. But I think the point was this early debate will give the Democrats, should he fail this stress test, an opportunity to free up his delegates at the convention and get another person's name on most of the state ballots.
Biden has been in Camp David for the last week, likely preparing for the debates. Has there ever been a period in US history since Woodrow Wilson where a president is less present in terms of working and doing his responsibilities as president of the United States?
There never has. The only rumors that used to swirl around FDR in 1945 and late 1944 after he was elected, and then early 45. Remember, he died April 6th of 1945, but he was, for most part, non compos mentis the last 2 months. He was decrepit, and people knew that, but that's the closest that ever happened. But what was different about Roosevelt, when he was a very sick man, and he had very high blood pressure, probably suffering from chronic urinary infections, melanoma, he still went out on the campaign trail all of 1944. There's famous pictures of him in New York in an open car in just a terrible rainstorm. So we've never seen any president do this, except Biden himself in 2020. He sequestered himself in his basement and outsourced his campaign to the mainstream media and Democratic surrogates. And I think they feel that worked. And so that's sort of been the playbook for the subsequent State of the Unions and major speeches and the midterms and things like that he just abdicates his roles and responsibilities, sleeps in, is surrounded by a series of subordinates that prep him, and then a lot of doctors are around him giving him various advice how to rest and to be more cognizant, probably with pharmaceuticals as the rumor.
Do you think that his willingness to debate shows that actually he isn't quite as old or sort of mentally unwell as perhaps we think he is?
No, I think it shows two things. That I don't think it was his choice to do that. I think he was under pressure by the hierarchy of the Democratic Party that had watched him decline in January, February, March. And then, but more importantly, somewhere around the first indictments, Trump started to beat him in the national polls by a point or two. Today, Quinnipiac, as I said, is 4 or 5 points. Rasmussen had him up 9 after the Fox poll had Biden up 2. And then more importantly, in the swing states, they're going to decide the election, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. Trump has substantial leads, 4 or 5 points. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, maybe 1 to 2 points. He's got an 18-point lead in Iowa that Obama won twice, but that's close to Minnesota where it's dead even, which is a blue state. So that reality was the catalyst that forced the Democratic funding class and the members of the Senate and House squad, et cetera, to go to Biden, I think, and say, look, you said you were going to only be a one-term president. You fulfilled your duties as the proper veneer to the Obama agenda. Good old Joe Biden from Scranton, but now your time is up. And then I think he said, well, I can still beat Donald Trump. And they said, okay, let's go, let's see it. But we can't do this in October because we'll have no fail-safe fallback position.
In terms of other presidential debates throughout history, how do you think this one will compare? I know that Reagan famously had his little quip about being old and so on. Do you think there are other debates where we can look back on and see some comparisons?
That's a very good question, and I thought about that actually. I went back and played some debates, and the one that struck me as the most relevant and opportune for this moment was the 1980 single debate between Carter and Reagan. And I look back at that race. I think we have a misconception of it because Reagan won by 9 points. So we had this idea that Reagan just blew him out. That was not the case at all. The second to the last Gallup poll, I think it was on October 21st, had Carter up by 7 points. There was a third-party candidate, as there is this year, John Anderson, and Carter was furious. I mean, because he was an independent, former liberal Republican, had turned independent, and Carter would not debate him, almost the way Kennedy is treated. And Reagan did. And Reagan didn't do very well against him. And so Carter came into that debate with a whole agenda of narratives. One of the narratives is he can't debate because he didn't do well. This is the only debate. I'm going to go after him. He's old. He's too old. He's never held federal office. He's dangerous. I've talked to Amy. She and my daughter, are worried about his trigger finger on nuclear weapons. He's George H.W. Bush called his economic plan of deregulation, tax cuts, and defense buildup voodoo economics. And he really, really went after it. Yeah. And at first, Reagan was flummoxed. And then as the hour and a half wore on, he just relaxed. And he said 3 or 4 times, "There you go again. There you go again." And what that debate did was it framed the two, and one of them was what came out of that debate. And Reagan said, "I didn't do the hyperinflation. I wasn't on duty when the hostages were taken. I wasn't responsible for the oil." And then Carter said, "Well, you don't have a plan." He said, "Well, there will be no hostages when I'm there. There will be no hostages, and we will pump oil, and we're going to unleash the power of American capitalism with a 28% tax rate." And when you left the debate, it was kind of a crabby, sanctimonious scold saying to the American people, we're in an era, kind of a Jerry Brown argument, we're in an era of limits, and we turn down our thermostats, kind of like that so-called malaise speech, even though he never used the word malaise earlier with the cardigan sweater. And Reagan was a can-do. Yes, we can do this for America. And I think people at that debate said, I've had it. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I know what's the hostages humiliation's about. I know the rescue mission failed. I know we have hyperinflation. Now we have stagflation. Russia's in Afghanistan. It's on the move. Our defenses are vulnerable. I've had it. I want to try it. I'm going to take a risk and vote for somebody who says we can do things rather than we can't do anything anymore. And I think that's very similar to the Biden-Trump contrast, with the caveat, of course, that Trump has a record that Reagan didn't as president.
Just sticking on the theme of Reagan, I know that many Republicans today, on the more populist side of things, are slightly more skeptical of Reagan than, let's say, the neocons were, particularly on issues of foreign policy. I know that the context was very different with the Soviet Union and so on. But also in terms of economics, Trump is more protectionist, and he spent a lot of money. I know he had his tax cuts as well. Do you think that we should be a bit cautious when looking to Reagan as a political ideal in terms of his foreign and economic policy?
I do a little bit, but I want, you went back at Reagan. Reagan was not George W. Bush. I'll give you a couple examples. When they blew up the 250-something Marines in Lebanon in 1983, Reagan's attitude was not to, he didn't want to put the Marines there. George Shultz suggested that he did. And then his attitude was just to pull them out and bring up a couple of Iowa-class battleships and blast the Becca Valley with, 1,700-pound artillery ship, 16-inch battle. And he did that for about a day or two. And then he went and said, I'm done with that. And then when Libya was responsible for a bombing that killed Americans, Europeans wouldn't let us fly over there. He just took some F-111s, refueled them in air, and bombed Gaddafi. And then he said, I'm done with it. So his attitude was sort of Jacksonian, like Trump. It was no better friend, no worse enemy, but he didn't go in on the ground like the two Bushes did. He didn't believe in that. He thought that America's power had to be deterrent, and the only way it could remain deterrent was to fight America's battles on its terms. And its terms were overwhelming technology, firepower, and to humiliate an enemy with that, but not to go into an inner city or in the Middle East. And in retrospect, it seems very similar to Donald Trump. Both of them also had one legitimate, I think there's a legitimate criticism of both. They both raised the debt considerably through deficit spending. And that started with Reagan. And since Reagan, we've had to tell you the truth, we only had 3 years of a balanced budget, and that was because Newt Gingrich forced Bill Clinton to cuts and tax raises, and we balanced the budget for 3 years. Then Bush doubled it, and then Obama doubled it, and then Trump ran up $6 trillion, and then Biden is on schedule. Maybe if he's another year, 7 months, he'll match that. Trump had the excuse of COVID when he was advised to, liquid for a liquid economy and pump it. But that's the thing that I think the only thing that worries a lot of conservatives about the Trump-Reagan similarities is that they weren't physically worried, and now at $36 trillion and borrowing that money at 5.5%, we have $1 trillion in interest payments, much larger. Neil Ferguson wrote an article about a month ago and said it's the same as the defense budget, but in the time that's elapsed, it's actually much larger now. It's $100 billion larger in debt service because we borrow $1 trillion every 90 days.
It seems ever since the election of FDR, the issue of a balanced budget has become very Keynesian, or at least the perception of Keynes. I think there's probably a sort of myth around what he believed in terms of spending and borrowing. But Coolidge's sort of surpluses and Hoover's view towards a balanced budget seem to be very unfashionable today. And I suppose part of that is because the American dollar and the American economy is so large that people don't think that it will default on its debt, and it has so much kind of economic power around the world that people think that America can afford to borrow vast sums of money. Do you think that that perception is changing and that America will soon come to regret having these huge deficits?
Yeah, it is. It's radically changing, but not because of increased wisdom or cognizance of the folly that we're engaged in. It's simply the interest rates. If you look at where these big deficits started, really, Bush did it because of the war, but Obama, that was the stimuli after the 2008 meltdown. And we got interest rates high, but then toward the end, we were down to almost zero. We were practically, because of inflation, at 2 or 3% under Obama, and then it went under Trump down to 2%. But we had almost zero interest rates, real interest rates. The interest rate was lower than the rate of inflation, and that encouraged people. And you actually heard it spoken that under modern monetary theory, the left said, it's just a gimmick of numbers. We print the money. We control the money supply. We can do whatever we want. And with zero interest, it's a win-win situation because we can spend more money on entitlements, and then all these wealthy people who have bought T-bills and U.S. bonds will they don't get any interest on it. We'll pay them back in inflated dollars. And that was almost, when you listen to some of the people around Obama before the interest rates took off in 22, that was what they said, only they had a fancy name called modern monetary theory. And so that the hyperinflation and then the subsequent reaction with higher interest, it destroyed that concept, and it's no longer going to be. I don't think we'll ever see de facto 0 or 1 or 2% interest rates again in my lifetime. I'm 70. I don't think you'll see you'll see it for 10 more years, because everybody understands it's unsustainable. Because all it does is encourage rapid deficit spending. Yeah.
What happened to the legacy and the view of presidents like Calvin Coolidge? Is there a perception that they are basically cruel-hearted or cruel-minded in terms of wanting to cut spending, and you have these kind of crude, evil capitalists who are just obsessed with balancing the books and don't have any care for sort of human beings and how that impacts them in terms of welfare spending and so on? I mean, is that basically the American perception?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't the American perception, but that came in with Obama when, for the first time, the way you can really adjudicate that is that Milton Friedman was sort of the par excellence adjudicator or the gold standard of the dangers of increasing the money supply. And he had made this very popular Free to Choose movie that just swept the United States. And so the argument was kind of over with. And then under Alan Greenspan, he was called the Wizard. And so during the Bush administration, we had almost no inflation because we kept control of the money supply, and we had moderate interest, about 5%, 6%, and that was kind of the idea, and it worked pretty well. If you look back at the Bush GDP inflation rate over the years, even with the deficit spending because of the wars, and then we got into that Milton Friedman was a mean person. He'd worked for the Chilean junta. And that all it did, what the new Keynesian argument was, all you do with trying to balance a budget, you increase the value of dollars for the people who don't need them and they have them in excess, and then you short the supply or the access to money by the people who do need them. And then when we went into zero interest rates at the end of the last part of the Obama administration, most of the Obama administration, the Biden, then the flip side said, look at this. All these wealthy people, they're losing money every year. Their 401ks that are too big. And there were even things that were proposed by the left that maybe they should have to surrender their 401ks and we'll give them credit through the Social Security system. But the idea was that whether it was canceling student loans or bringing in illegal aliens, or providing amnesties of various sorts, or reparations for Black Americans. The whole idea was it doesn't really matter that we're borrowing staggering amounts of money, because eventually we have a rendezvous, we being, what they meant by we, the country, was really wealthy people, and they're going to have their taxes raised, and that's a good thing. So it was kind of gorge the beast, and that if you gorge the beast, and you spend so much, then you'll have to raise taxes. And Reagan's was cut the beast, cut the beast, cut the beast. And then you can lower taxes. But this was the idea that you're going to deliberately just waste money and spend it and build back better, inflation reduction, all these Orwellian terms. And then wealthy people will have to step up and, as Biden says, pay their fair share. And that was their operating. If he is elected again, he's already said that he's going to increase the top rate along California lines. Here in California, the wealthy pay 13.2%. That's on top of it, 38% federal, another 8 or 9% payroll taxes on the first 200,000 essentially, and then property gas taxes. So people are paying that are, if they don't pay capital gains and their income, and they pay on their income, they're paying about 55 or 60%. We have a higher tax rate, people forget that, than most EU countries.
The UK is pretty, that sounds pretty good compared to the UK, to be fair. Our tax rate is just insane.
No, the UK is much more reasonable than we are. In California, we reduced the 76 billion deficit to 47. I don't know how we're going to get down because we can't borrow money as a state. But we've lost 10 million people who fled because of the tax rate. They're talking about raising the tax rate from 13.2 to 16%. 1% of the state in terms of households that file taxes pay 50% of the income tax. 50% of residents don't pay any income tax. And so what's happened in this state, we have half of the illegal aliens. We have 27% of the people were not born in the state. And people have flooded in because of the generous subsidies and entitlements and the fact that you don't have to pay income tax. And the people who do pay it, the upper middle class and the wealthy pay capital gains mostly, so they're exempt. They just fled in droves, and so we're losing $30 to $40 billion in revenue a year from them. And the attitude is kind of a doom loop, because the state legislator Newsom say, well, we have to raise taxes, and people say to them, but if you raise taxes, another 10 million are going to leave.
It sounds like California is turning into South Africa in many ways, where a very small portion of the population is paying a huge amount of tax and lots of people are paying no tax.
It's kind of like California, or maybe even worse, the United States is turning into California, following the failed Newsom model. I think that's a big thing, that when we look at Europe, we always thought that Europe was crazy, it was socialist, it did things that we would never consider. But when you look at these issues that we have embraced, high taxation that is completely targeted at wealthy people, protecting 15-year-olds so they don't have to ask their parents for transitional serious surgeries to become of the opposite sex. And then you look at our crime and the way that we react to crime, and you look at our open border compared to the Greek border or Italian border or French border. You can make the argument that Europe is much more conservative than we are. Many countries in Europe would not allow this transsexual surgery on minors. They wouldn't think of paying reparations to people, at least the mainstream wouldn't. Their borders are more secure now than ours. And I think the parties that are coming into prominence in Europe are much stronger than the conservative movement in the United States. So,
well, when Europe seems to be doing better than California, that's when you have to start worrying.
Yes, it is. It is.
I do want to talk about immigration later, but just for now, I want to ask about McCarthyism and the comparisons between McCarthyism in the 1950s and what's going on today with Donald Trump and his MAGA supporters. Do you think that McCarthyism was right? Do you think that the Rosenbergs should have been executed? And do you see comparisons today with Trump?
The left uses McCarthyism as in its twilight stages where it sort of overreached. So there were people around Joe McCarthy who went back and they went after celebrities or media people or politicians who flirted with not the hardcore. They were obviously, the Rosenbergs were complete traitors. They should have been executed. Alger Hirsch was guilty. But McCarthy, when he would hold up a list and say, I have 455 names, and he couldn't bring the evidence, but it was that McCarthyism was in reaction to two things in this country. The old isolationist right had warned America in June of 1941, do not give aid to the Soviet Union, because if you do, they will defeat easily the Germans. That was wrong, easily, but they will end up in Europe and they will pose as great a threat as Hitler. Our George Patton at the end of the war said, how ironic that we went into Europe to stop totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and when we left Europe ensuring that it was there. And so there was this idea, there's a bunch of communists, and there were in the State Department, that forced us to be an ally of the Soviet Union. We supplied Britain and the United States in tandem supplied 30% of its wherewithal to win that war. And we created this horrific monster. You can argue which one was worse. I think Hitler might have been worse at the time, but there was an argument, who did this? And then the second shoe that fell was, we had given billions of dollars to Chiang Kai-shek, and he had controlled 65% of the country. And Mao was just kind of a renegade, and the Long March was a disaster for him. And then all of a sudden, 1947, 48, this communist government, and it was crazy. And then the next thing we knew, we were fighting 1 million Chinese in Korea, and everybody said, Chiang Kai-shek, the Flying Tigers, Claire Chennault, we loved the Chinese people. They lost 15 million to the Japanese. This was the Asian country that we had Christian missionaries in. They couldn't even go in Japan. So we were so pro-Chinese, and then to all of a sudden to be confronted with the idea that the two largest countries in area and population were now enemies and communists, and we had helped them, then the argument bounced back here and said, who fueled these monsters? It was the State Department, it was the Defense Department, it was the Roosevelt, it was the Truman administration. And that was what launched Joe McCarthy.
Just briefly on that, sorry to interrupt, but just very briefly on the Chinese angle. Do you think that Harry Hopkins was a communist spy? And do you think that people like Edgar Snow basically led to FDR and the people around him to be very pro-Mao?
I think that's true. I don't know how active Harry Hopkins is. You know, he suffered from stomach cancer and he was very frail, but he had that very famous, it was very heroic. He flew from, as you know, from England all the way, I think in a Lancaster or DC-3 or something, all the way to the Soviet Union. He met with Stalin for 6 hours and he asked Stalin, what do you want? And Stalin gave him just 400,000 trucks and 30% of our aviation fuel and all the aluminum, and we gave them everything. And later, in every single argument in the White House, he prevailed. He moved into the White House. He was the closest advisor. So I guess that the trajectory to Yalta, you had this Orwellian situation where Roosevelt called Churchill up and said, Uncle Joe hates you and he likes me, so I'm going to deal with him. I don't want you interrupting. It was very humiliating to Churchill, given that he had been, fighting the Nazis alone from June 20th of 1940 all the way to the entrance of the Soviet Union, and a year later, on the 22nd, there was nobody but Britain. And here's the Americans who come in late and say, they should have said, we really admire you because this monster hates you. But instead, we conspired with Stalin. And the question is, why would that happen? And that was people in the State Department like Alger Hiss, Harry Hopkins. Cordell Hull was very naive as Secretary of State for most of the time. A nice guy, but there was a lot of naivete there. And a lot of it was coming out of the Depression and the rise of the left, the New Deal people. All of those people that were the architects of the New Deal transitioned very smoothly into pro-Soviet. And it was kind of a gift from God that in 1944, June, July, Roosevelt had failed so, and Henry Wallace was a communist, and he was vice president. Nice guy, multimillionaire entrepreneur, but he was a communist. And he was headed to be president. And then the guys in the back room from Chicago and the big cities got together at the 44 convention and got rid of him. And then it was kind of like Kamala Harris. Who do we get? And there was this guy that nobody ever heard of called Harry Truman. They said, well, he's from the machine in Kansas City. He's an old-time Pole. He's a Missourian. He'll keep the South with us. Got a kind of a Southern accent, and he was pretty good on uncovering corruption. And they put him in there, and everybody thought he would. Roosevelt just ignored him for the first 6 months, and then 5 months, and then when he died, he didn't know anything, and everybody thought he would be a tool of this group that we talked about. And then, after about a couple of months, he said, "That son of a bitch, Stalin lied to me." And the next thing you knew, we were in Korea, and he was the Cold Warrior par excellence.
In reaction to the communists around FDR, or the communist supporting people, and the fact that America supplied the Soviet Union with so many weapons and so on, in the 1950s, you then had McCarthyism. And I just want you to, again, comment on comparisons between that and what's happening today with the MAGA people.
The MAGA people being accused of McCarthyism, or what?
No, a sort of reverse McCarthyism against MAGA supporters. So you've got Trump going to prison, potentially. You've got Steve Bannon. You've got Peter Navarro. You've got other people.
The people who are going after, who have this asymmetrical Jacobin agenda and asymmetrical, and it means if Eric Holder refuses a House subpoena, nobody puts him in jail. He brags about it on Fast and Furious. If Bannon or Navarro do, they go to jail. And, when you look at each of these cases, we know one thing is in common about the 5 court appearances of Trump so far. First of all, they would have never been filed had he not run for re-election. Number 2, these charges have never been filed about anybody else. They will never be filed again against anybody else. They're so absurd. Nobody in the future will try to remove somebody from the ballot, because if they do, the other side will do the same. That's what stopped it. People say the Supreme Court stopped it. There were a lot of red states that were going to try to remove Biden from the ballot. That's the only thing the left understands. And so, yes, what the left is doing in a strange way is creating this hysteria. But there's a difference between McCarthy. There was a kernel of truth that the communists had hijacked the party that was in power to the detriment of the collective interest of the United States. And so but this hysteria, Russian collusion, laptop disinformation, January 6th, there was nothing to it. It's completely fabricated. It's more like the Salem witch trials. There were no witches, but the McCarthy period, there were communists. They were a little different, the two hysteria. This hysteria that they're using against the MAGA people. We're going to see a debate tonight where Dana Bash, one of the moderators, so-called moderators, her husband was one of the 51 quote-unquote intelligence authorities that sprung that October surprise and said, where Joe Biden looked at Trump and said, "You're lying. Hey, America, he's lying." 51 intelligence authorities, retired, have sworn this has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Now we learn that 12 of them were not retired. They were actually working as contractors for the CIA when they signed that letter, including the architect of it, Mike Morrell. And who prompted it? It was Anthony Blinken's idea, who's the Secretary of State. And he was only following the tracks of Jake Sullivan in 2016, who cooked up the Alpha Ping caper that Trump's computer in his tower was communicating with the Alpha Bank in Russia. That was Jake Sullivan that did that. So I guess what I'm saying is there any evidence that Donald Trump was colluding with Russia in the way that Harry Hopkins and all? No. There was a lot of evidence, and this is even harder to stomach, that Hillary Clinton was using Dushenko and a lot of Russian disinformation herself, as was Christopher Steele, about the PP tape and visiting a consulate. All of that was made up, but it came from Russian sources. And when you actually look at the record of Biden versus Trump, Biden said on the eve of the invasion of February 24th of Ukraine, 2022, he said, "My reaction will depend on whether it's a major or minor invasion. We can get Zelensky out the first week. Let's get him out. Vladimir, if you're going to hack, please don't hack American hospitals and charity institutions," that kind of stuff. And what did Trump do? He flooded the world with cheap oil that Russia hated. He put more sanctions on the oligarchs. He unfroze offensive weapons to Ukraine. He was the one, not Obama, that sent them javelins. Unlike Biden, who put a hold on munitions, Trump did not. He got out of an asymmetrical missile deal with Russia, and he was pretty hard on Russia. And yet, you had to hear all this crap of this hysteria, and they're doing it again right now. As we speak today, the 51 experts were discredited. Now we have 16 experts, economists, that signed a letter, and they're claiming that Donald Trump will give us hyperinflation. That's a hard sell, because he left office with a 1.6 inflation rate, and Biden got up at one point to 9%. Collectively on staples, food, gas were 30% higher than when he took office. And yet these same people are warning us about Trump will give us hyperinflation, and yet They were the architects of Build Back Better and the Inflation Reduction Acts, which did give us inflation. And now we learn of the 16 who signed it, I think 10 of them were major donors to the Biden campaign. So it's the same stuff, same administrative state, Anthony Fauci, Mayorkas, all of these people. And I think that's the greatest threat that I think Americans see today, that we've created a huge federal bureaucracy, but more importantly, a hierarchy between New York and Washington, and finance, defense, taxes, intelligence, the military, and they're a permanent caste, and they're left-wing. And the left loves them. The left used to think they were authoritarians because of their military or intelligence connections, or they are, and now they feel that they bypass the legislative process, and by fiat and executive orders, they get everything they want, from green policies, DEI, transgender in the military. So this is really weird, this last 10 years, how the left has gravitated to using non-elected power in the United States to implement all of their agendas did not come from the legislative process. Whether it's amnesty for illegal aliens, or student loan debt, or destroying the border, these have all been processes in the Congress, and they weren't. They were administrative state agency directives from the president.
It's fascinating how many comparisons there are between what's happening in the UK and in the US, where in the UK you have these what we call quangos, which are sort of government bodies, or government bodies which are non-political, and suddenly they had huge power over policy areas instigated by Tony Blair. And in reaction to that, conservatives in the UK have said, and famously Michael Gove said this, a minister in the British government, we've had enough of experts. And in UK conservatism, there's been a long history of a skepticism towards so-called experts. Lord Salisbury, a British prime minister back in the 19th century, famously was very suspicious of so-called experts. And I think what you're sort of tapping into there, I'm sure there's a similar thing in US conservatism, is a healthy skepticism of the managerial class, of people with PhDs. And you're talking about, these economists or these national security advisors. I think in the UK, there was this famous letter signed by many, many economists saying that Thatcherism was basically going to fail just before Thatcher came in and completely revitalized the British economy. So perhaps you need more skepticism of experts.
I think you're absolutely right about the similarities. Here, one of the positive things is that when you talk about a managerial class, a technocracy in the European sense, they get their legitimacy from these universities. There's only about 9 or 10 of them: Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, Berkeley. And what you're seeing now, it's kind of a scab that's been pulled off with the anti-Semitism, the Middle East, these protests. And you're starting to, the public is starting to look at things. They said, oh my God, they took away the SAT for 4 years. Stanford only let in 9% of their 2,100 entering class the last 3.5 years were white males. And we're looking at all these, the types of Alvin Bragg or Fannie Willis or Judge Mershon or all of these, or Anthony Fauci or Mayorkas. And we look at all these people and they're not very well educated and they don't know very much. And so we think, but why are they prestigious when they have this cursus honorum? Yesterday, Blinken had a meeting with his State Department envoy for religious freedom in the world, Mr. Rashid Hussain. And it was very funny. If you looked at the speech, it was all basically about, the subtext was Western intolerance of Islam. And this happened right when Middle East students, green card holders, swarmed a synagogue in Los Angeles and tried to get out and beat people up. And we've had this epidemic on campus. It's mostly on campuses. You don't see it in the Midwest. You don't see it in small towns. It is a left-wing, elite, globalist phenomenon, this hatred of Jews. And what I'm getting at is when you look at the quality of people who have graduated in the last 3 or 4 years from these places, you look at the Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, was a serial plagiarist. And when people actually looked at her record, they said, oh my God, to be a full professor of political science, at Harvard, you need 5 or 6 books. She's never written one on her own, and what she did write was plagiarized. They look at Mr. Bowman, who he was a congressional person he just lost yesterday. I thought, my gosh, said he was a middle school principal in the Bronx. Now he plagiarized his entire EDD, his doctorate in education thesis. We look at Fannie Willis, and people are saying, well, they all have one thing in common. They came out of these schools, these schools are not very prestigious. And then you hear professors, and Yale gives now 80% of its grades are A. Stanford's about 65. So if you talk to a Stanford professor off the record, and I do all the time, they'll say, I don't know what we would do. I'd like to open admissions, but now I've got students, according to our own standards, can't do the work that we said was essential for our prestigious brand. So I either have to give them all A's or water down the coursework or introduce new courses. And they've been doing this for a number of years, even before George Floyd. But when they got rid of the actual SAT, that freed them of the burden of being accused of letting in students that were 250 points lower on these tests than others. And the result is it's finally filtered down to the public. And so people are saying, wow, Disney, Target, Anheuser-Busch, but what happened to Boeing? Boeing's incompetent now. It was so much better than Airbus. And then you go look at the DEI policies, and then you look at the FAA, and we've had more near misses or runarounds on the landing, taking off, trying it again. And then you talk to people in Silicon Valley, and I think once a week somebody from Silicon Valley calls me and says, why didn't you write about this? And this is, we can't hire these people anymore. They don't know anything. They come and they think they're from Stanford or they're from Berkeley. There's not enough Caltech people. We don't trust MIT anymore. And when they come into our Silicon Valley high-tech company, they go right to HR. So not only do they not know anything, they start causing trouble. We don't want them. And I always say the same thing. Who would you want? Well, we want Texas A&M. We want Georgia Tech. We want Baylor. We want a red state. And that's really, it's kind of a doom loop these universities are in. And one of the reasons that you see this left hysteria among the managerial classes that we just talked about concerning Trump is he hasn't been subtle about what he wants to do to higher education. I mean, some of the things, if he were to win the Senate, would be mind-boggling. He would go to Harvard $60 billion in tax endowment. And that might mean another $2 billion. And if the way these universities work, their endowments are locked up in long-term investments, and they usually depend on their $3 to $8 billion budgets on annual giving. Well, that's going down now because of what they're doing. And if you were to tax them, they would really be in trouble. The second thing he wants that the people around him is getting out of the $1.7 trillion student loan business and making these elite universities pledge their own endowment against the loans that they offer. And then you would not see a much DEI, because we know one thing, they're very greedy, grasping institutions, and the faculty and the administrators protect themselves. And the idea they're going to let a bunch of kids take gender studies and DEI classes that default on the loans, and it will come out of their operating budget, and they won't tolerate that. And then he's even talked about an exit test. Everybody, if they have to take an SAT to get in, why not take one to get out? So that paranoia and deportation are the two issues. Everybody says he's going to war on the universities. It's another Orwellian. We let in 10 million people. We destroyed the border, and they're all broke the law. They're all here illegally. But Donald Trump wants to deport them. Can you imagine that? It's going to be like the partition between India and Pakistan, or that's what they talk about. We're going to have mass expulsions. They're going to come in to your home, and they're going to ask for an ID to everybody. This is what they're doing now.
You've hit on two very interesting topics, immigration and the decline of standards or the decline of intelligence even amongst elite educated individuals. Do you see a comparison between the collapse of the Roman Empire or the decline of the Roman Empire in both of those things? So they saw massive immigration from barbarian tribes, but there was also this sort of lack of knowledge or inherited knowledge. People started to become less intelligent, started to forget how to do things, and slowly that empire kind of withered away. So do you think those two things are sort of reminiscent of what's happening in America today?
Well, what happened with Rome very quickly is that was surely true of the Republic, and from the period of the Marius Sulla into Milo and Claudius, and then into the denouement with Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, and then later Augustus. And what you saw there was a transition from an Italian yeoman republic to a world society. And then one of the hallmarks were, 2 million slaves were brought into Italy. It destroyed the working classes. The soldiers were out on duty for 16, 17 years. There was bread and circus entitlements in Rome. And when you had provincial legates, they could go out to Palestine, they'd go up to Gaul, or they could go down to Africa, and they would have more wealth, more power than the consuls in Rome. So you had this tearing apart of this old republican virtue, and that's what characterizes the literature of, say, Catullus's poems, or Livy's famous preamble to the history written around 30 BC, where he said that we're at a point where the medicine would be worse than the disease. We can't withstand what's going on. What we couldn't withstand the corrective. It's so bad. And then that goes into the empire. And during the early empire, you have Suetonius's Life of the 12 Caesars, Tacitus's Annals, especially Petronius's Satyricon, where it's transgender, sexual, blending of the sexes. There's even a poem by Catullus about mutilation and removing your testicles and becoming another sex, and how horrible this is. And but there is a hiatus there, and that hiatus is the Republic is dead, but for about 250 years, the system is expanded. And when I mean the system, habeas corpus, even though it's autocratic, you've got about 100 years of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius, Pius, Marcus Aurelius. What Gibbon said was the best 100 years. And what he meant by that was suddenly aqueducts, roads, habeas corpus, a uniform Xerox blueprint for most of the 70 million. And that, for a while, was so much better than, there was no wars. And then the inherent decadence started to break down. What do I mean by decadence? You mentioned people coming across the Danube and Rhine River. And what that meant was, when they came across, they were not assimilated. They kept their own language, their own customs. They broke rules. You couldn't be married in the legion. They married. They lived near the Rhine. So if an emperor said, we have an outbreak in Dalmatia, we need Legion 19 from the Rhine to go, they said, no. We're Germans. We're not Romans. So there was a fragmentation by the 3rd century, ethnic identity, chauvinism, and that system that was so cohesive for 200 years that still had the fumes of Italian values of the Republic. It started to fragment. And we know what Diocletian is a good example. We know there was inflation. We know there was consumption. There was no longer income. It had reached its predatory limits. So the growth of the empire meant you could gobble up a province, strip it of its slave, get more slaves, more labor, and then you could drain it. And it was kind of predatory. But once it reached its natural limits and couldn't expand anymore, it started to cannibalize itself. And of course, the old idea, quis sum Romanus, quis sum Romanus, I am a Roman citizen, didn't mean anything anymore. It didn't mean anything where you were. The only weird thing about it all is, in the East, there was something about Hellenism and the split, the growing split between Orthodoxy and what would become Roman Catholicism, and maybe the natural defenses of the Dardanelles and the Hellespont and the Black Sea But the Eastern Empire then was very different, and it lasted for 1,100 years. And when I mean very different, it became ultra-conservative, almost reactionary. And you had Justinian, and they hadn't had a plague. He recaptured 75% of the Western Empire before it collapsed again. But I think if you read Gibbon or you read Peter Heather, modern scholars, it's the same theme, that what destroyed Rome was destruction of the currency, entitlements to people who were not productive, a huge slave class, the destruction of the middle class, and an inability to assimilate, intermarry, and integrate millions of people who were pouring in that wanted the benefits of clean water, prosperity, the rule of law, but they didn't contribute to it. They were antithetical to it, and that finally just fragmented it. And so I am worried about that, because I live in a community that's 85% Hispanic, and it has about 40% of the people are so-called undocumented or illegal. And when you see people on your own, where I live was kind of like it's a different climate, but it was like a British village of the 1930s. Nobody had a key for their farmhouse. They were all little small, very well-kept small farms. Everybody knew each other. Everybody had baseball, little league, everything. And now it's latifundia. These huge corporate farms came in, bought the land, took the old farmhouses and rented them out to illegal aliens, who then brought in 30 or 40 people. And a quarter mile from here, there was the old farmhouse. I used to visit the farmer and his wife and their kids. They were friends of mine. And now there must be 10 shacks that are around it with no cesspools, just porta potties that they pump out once in a while. They have Romex wires strung, and there's dogs, chickens, horses, all in violation of every zoning, health law. And there's trafficking, there's drugs, and I have to be careful whether I say it. We've had Fox News came out here and did a documentary on it near my house. So it's very much like Rome. And the medicine would be, in California, the Californians have decided the medicine is worse than the disease. And so by that I mean, I would say 25% of the California market is a black market, and it's run by DEI people, immigrants, and they have huge swap meets. If I get in my car, I could drive in 10 minutes and buy a shovel, a mattress, food, flowers, anything on a road corner, and I would never pay sales tax, and they don't pay income tax on it. I can get any type of food I want from a canteen. These people that live out here, that's the beginning of the problem. What do you do with their trash? If I don't put my trash and separate it out here in the country for the trash removal company, I'm in big trouble. But they just hire local people to go dump it in vineyards and orchards all around. So I get up every Sunday morning and I come out, I can see oil cans, tires, paint, wet diapers, drugs, and I have to pick it up. And it's all Spanish literature. Never their address where you can trace them, but their mail, junk mail and everything. And yet, if I write about that, and I have, Microsoft just said my website was a malicious website. And I've never used a bad word or an illiberal term, but just talking about this. And where I work at Hoover, when you have all these elites at Stanford who are for open borders, the whole Stanford faculty is served by nannies, cooks, landscapers, very cheap, and yet you say something, they'll say to you, well, I gave all my used clothes to my nanny, and she's a wonderful person. And you say, well, where does she live? Well, she drives in from Salinas. I said, well, is she legal? I don't know. I don't care. But so that is a breakdown in society that's happening. 50 million people now, the largest in numbers and percentages, were never born in the United States. They came. Could be an advantage if they were integrated and assimilated, but they're not. And I worry about the West in general because we have all, Europe especially, but also us, all the signs of civilizational decay with the fertility rate well below 2. It's 1 point. We went from 2.1 in 2000 to 1.67, almost below 1.7. And the decline of a 2-parent, 3-children family, which is considered obscene, I suppose. 5, the decline of organized religion. The decline of the military, we're 45,000 recruits short. They're almost all, according to what the Pentagon will let us know, they try to hide it. They're white males who died at double their numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq and the demographics. So here you have the Pentagon saying DI, white privilege, we're going to root out white supremacists. Oh, by the way, if you don't want to get vaccinated, it's all you white Trump MAGA people, get out, 8,500. And then all of a sudden they say, oh my God, we're 45,000 troops short. And oh my God, the 45,000 are all those crazy guys from Kansas and Nebraska that wanted to go to Fallujah and fight, or Helmand Province. 35% of the population and 75% of the people dead were them. And so it's a collective suicidal impulse. And I don't know how to arrest it. I really don't. This election, everybody says that elections will be important, but this one will be important.
What you describe is incredibly bleak. In order to save the Republic, to save Rome, do we need a Caesar, a Sulla, an Augustus? And is Trump that man? I know the left like to portray Trump as Caesar. They did so in a play in New York once, I believe, a sort of Shakespearean play. Do we need a new Caesar?
I don't know. I don't think we need somebody to break the law, but we have elements. The thing that's very complicated about this is we are in the most lawless era we've ever had with the left. They have no regard for swarming police, swarming the homes of Supreme Courts, which is against the law. They have no regard for locking up parents at school board meetings. They have no regard for locking up former officials, going after people, destroying the border, draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve without congressional they are lawless Jacobins. So we don't need somebody to be like that. And what's weird about it, if we're going to be saved, it's going to be somebody who comes in and says, I am going to enforce the existing laws. I'm not going to make new ones. I'm going to enforce the existing laws. And what would that entail? We have a right to we have more natural oil and gas, and we were the architects of the nuclear industry. So we're going to have nuclear power, and we are going to be the biggest exporter of natural gas and oil and self-sufficient. And that would be perfectly legal. That would cause a storm. We're going to close the border, and we're not going to let anybody in unless they come legally, and the numbers are going to be much smaller, and we're going to deport all the recent people who came, and then we'll look at the next 20 million. And then they would have to say, we are going to use existing racketeering charges for these people in Antifa and BLM who cross state lines to foment urban violence. And they would have to do that. And then they would have to say, we are not going to destroy, 60 years of women's sports by allowing people who are biological males, for example, and look at that issue, that social issue. And he can do that. And the advantage of Trump is, I wrote about that a long time ago, he's a Sophoclean John Ford figure out of John Ford's Western or Sophocles' early plays, in the sense that he's only going to be there for 4 years. He really does not care what people say about him. No politician could have taken what he's taken with these lawsuits and the vituperation. And I don't know if his health he's 78, but should he get in, he understands that, like the proverbial gunslinger that comes in when, the small farmers can't deal with the cattle barons, as Shane or High Noon, all these characters out of our Westerns. He understands that what he has to do will be unpopular. They will hate him, but as a tragic hero, and they'll be happy when he leaves, but they will eventually appreciate what he did. And so how does that filter down before tonight's debate, just in conclusion? I have never seen people in this country say things like, hey, Victor, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Or they'll make fun, I'm going to vote for Rump. I'm going to vote for the skunk. I said, really? I don't want to talk about it. I have not met a Latino neighbor over the age of 40 who was male who is not voting for Trump. And every single one of those people. So when they look at those statistics and they say blacks might go from 12 to 22%, that's been steady for 3 months. Or Latinos are 50-50, or young people might be 50-50. You hear this all the time. You did not hear it in 2016. You did not hear it in 2020. And the only thing that could stop Trump from being reelected is this revolutionary thing that they pulled off in 2020, where the electorate went from a traditional 30% not voting on election day to 70% because they changed the laws in most states. And there's no way to adjudicate a ballot that's harvested, third party, early voting, comes in 10 days after the. So I don't know what the effect of that. And I think he'll have to win the swing states by at least 5 points, given what's going on. But if he were to be elected, and if he were to be healthy, and given what he knows from the last 4 years, it will be different. And that's what's causing the hysteria. If you look at the heritage, this Plan 2025, they're open about it. Kevin Roberts just gets on television and they just level this vituperation at him, the head of the heritage. He just says, yes, we're advising him. We've got to get rid of 20,000 political appointments. Obama got rid of that many. We're going to get rid of all of them. And then we're not going to replace them. And we're going to close the border. And we're not going to wait around and look for Romney and a McCain type people to advise us, or Paul Ryan. We don't care. They're gone. The other final, and I'll be quiet, is that the Never Trump movement of the Republican Party is now non-existent. The George Wills, the Bill Kristols, the David Frums, they have either become outwardly like Bill Kristol, left-wing, and they've just changed their contributors from right-wing billionaires to left-wing billionaires, or they're irrelevant. If today George Will or Bill Kristol said, we're going to sponsor a third-party candidate as an alternative to Trump, as they did in 2016, nobody would care. Nobody knows who they are. They're completely irrelevant. And that's really amazing that it would be in the UK that all of your London insider conservative pundits, suddenly they lost their speaking audience, they lost their columns, they lost their influence, and they're not invited, they're not wanted at any conservative group. And yet, in the past, they reacted to that and did their best to destroy, and now they're completely impotent. And that's a really big change in my life. All the people I grew up reading, in my 20s, they've all refuted or separated themselves from their prior. If you look at what they're writing about abortion or an open border or the economy, it's all left wing. And to the extent that it's not left wing, nobody reads it anyway because they don't have a conservative audience.
Well, in the UK, we've got an election on the 4th of July, and it's very likely the Conservative Party will be nearly wiped out in that election. And I think many people, UK Conservatives, are celebrating that because they've been totally betrayed on so many issues, including immigration. And just to end the interview, one final question. On the issue of immigration, does it matter that the US is about to become a minority white country? The UK is on a similar trend, maybe just a bit behind. Is that important? Does that matter?
It does matter if people vote according to their ethnic or tribal affiliations, yes. And they have been doing that. But I think people in Europe should realize that one of the reasons that people hate Donald Trump is that as we speak today, he went to downtown Philadelphia, he went into downtown LA, he went to the Bronx. And what he's trying to do is substitute middle class solidarity for race. And he's saying to African Americans and Latinos, he's saying, you guys got to realize that the people that are black and Latino on TV or in the squad are not white. They're like the white global elite that live on the two coasts. They treat you like they treat us. They hate MAGA. and we don't like them. And you gotta realize that you don't believe in transgenderism. You don't believe in cutting back on oil and gas. You don't believe in an open border. And your representatives are in league with this white bicoastal. And we, the Republican Party, if you look at us, we're not the Mark Zuckerbergs. We're not the Bill Gates. We're not the hyper-plutocratic class. So he has created a workers' populist party, and they hate that. When Joe Biden told Charlemagne the God, "You ain't black," that really struck a lot of people. So it's going to be very slow because they have a lot of incentives. They can cancel student loans, they can open the border and they can give a lot of stuff away free, and they're doing that really rapidly. But I think it's the only thing that will save the United States, to make a conservative populist party where race is incidental. And I'm starting to see it. When I go to the supermarket, I'm about the only white person there in my community. And two things I notice. Once in a while, you'll see, if you go early in the morning, other white farmers are still around, and they'll come up to you. They don't know who I am. They'll say, "Hey, how are you? Everything going okay?" And what they're really, the subtext is, we're minorities and they hate us, and we want to bound together by tribe like they do. It's I don't feel comfortable about it. But the other thing that's even more, that it's more striking and positive rather than kind of weird, is Mexican American people will come up and they'll say things like, "Victor, don't worry, I'm voting for the big guy. I'm voting for Jefe." And I've had that 6 or 7 times every time I go to this store. And he said, and they all watch Fox News. And so, but their elites hate them. And the people that you hear about, the Latino caucus, the Black caucus, I think they're getting massive defections. And because of the nature of the Democratic Party that so alienated the white working class, they're going to lose 60% of the white vote, and probably 65 or 70% of the white male vote. And they had no margin of error. So they pandered and pandered, and they need 90% of the black vote and 55% of the Latino vote and 55% of the Asian. And so far, they're not getting any of that. And so I'm hoping that this election will be like 1988, where it's very close. All the pundits say that Reagan, Trump are crazy. It's close. The last poll shows Biden ahead, and then people just go into the polls and just say, "I'm had it, I'm done with him," and vote the way. And I think there's a 60-40 chance that's going to happen.
Thank you so much, Victor, for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen, for having me.